Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, an errant branch of the Menshevik Party who are particularly interested in preserving dustbins and ash heaps for future generations. This week's episode is a continuation of our series on The Decline of the West, Volume 1, by Oswald Spengler. Today we're discussing chapters 7 and 8, called Music and Plastic 1, The Arts of Form, and Music and Plastic 2, Act and Portrait, respectively. Now, shilling time. I've recently published a novel called Tower, involving the medical treatment of souls, literally becoming your job, mass de-existence events based on stock exchange data, the phenomenology of dinner plates, and one very, very tall tower. This book is reminiscent of The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov and Robot by Adam Vishnievsky-Snerk. And if this sounds even remotely interesting to you, then I highly recommend you buy a copy from Amazon or Apple Books. Links in the show description, or go to www.jackbc.me. That is jackbc.me for more information. Additionally, we've also got a Patreon account for the Book Club from Hell. If you like what we're doing with this podcast, then signing up to the Patreon is a real help, as is rating us 5 stars on your podcast app of choice or telling friends and family about our podcast and encouraging them to listen. So, if you're ready to learn why Leonardo da Vinci left so many paintings unfinished at the Studio Brown stage, then listen on. Enjoy. He was obviously a very, very cultured man, knew a great deal about art, and expressed his love of art in a very strange way by really obsessing over particular aspects of art.
He loved art and
blue-green, the colour of infinity, the Studio Brown, dissolving borders, the golden Magian background, and how Greek statues could ultimately be viewed from any angle and separated themselves from the temple wall. He loved art, but that love expressed itself in very, very strange and quite unique ways. To Mr.
He definitely
Oswald
had
Spengler.
a unique view of the world. It's funny that I was saying just before we started the recording that he's actually a fanboy. he's a mad fanboy of all sorts of different art, and it's interesting that he didn't just go into art history proper as a direct study. Instead, he went into politics and mathematics. But yeah, clearly a very cultured person. It must have been weird to have gone to like an orchestra performance or just visit an art gallery with
as
this man.
Spengler.
You know, like it would have been really weird for his friends trying to like, man, we really want to go to this art gallery, but should we invite Oswald? I don't know. He's going to go on about how
he's going to start talking about how this is so obviously music in oil painting.
I just can't deal with that today.
Start losing his shit over the visible brush strokes, which hint at infinity, which turn this portrait from a static image into one of motion, which expresses becoming or a moment of becoming. It's a history. It's a biography in painting.
I think what's interesting is like he's trying to make an argument for the objectiveness of his own interpretation in a weird way.
Yes,
I don't know if he would say that himself
like,
directly.
He's definitely arguing for it being correct, but he also repeatedly says that it is of the Faustian soul, and the only people who can understand it are also people of the Faustian soul, and addresses himself. Because did you notice throughout the book he talks about us? So he's not even implicitly, he's just explicitly writing this only for other Faustians, because we are the only other people who could possibly understand this.
But then the thing is, how does he know that others couldn't understand him?
Well, because he said that they can't. He says that they can't earlier in the book.
if other cultures can't understand, if people of different cultures can't understand one another, then how come one of them gets the special exception to know which things the other ones can't understand?
Well, he's really lucky in that he is Faustian. He says that it's the Faustian spirit that is one of distance that allows him to stand back with distance and with a historical eye and order all other cultures and make almost this genealogy of culture.
But in itself is still not objective because it's still Faustian.
It's still Faustian, yeah.
Still culturally relative. So it could be wrong.
It depends on so right and wrong in this context gets a bit murky. It's within the context of the Faustian soul, correct? I guess it's so there's some sort of underlying reality which is run through the depth of Faustian soul, and the shape of that Faustian soul's depth will give this particular description of reality a shape which is within the context of the Faustian soul, correct? At least if I understand it properly, which I might not.
I think that's a big call. So I think you're going to be one of the world's foremost experts in the decline of the West by the end of this 8-part series.
I doubt that. There are people who get really obsessive about these books.
I watched this one lecture by a German guy who really likes Spengler and the decline of the West. I watched a couple of other. I watched a few videos of other people trying to explain his point of view, but they always kind of leave out the mystical, supernatural claims of like these souls of the culture. They always kind of dance around. I noticed they never actually talk about that. They talk about like, oh yeah, we can think of like different cultures and civilizations going through like stages, like summer, spring, autumn, winter, and stuff, and there's these but they leave out he literally thinks that there's like a soul of the culture that's emanating, becoming into the world through artistic forms and stuff like that. They leave out all of this stuff.
I guess he doesn't really specify the nature of the soul when he talks about soul. So it's not clear whether he means it
like there's an ethereal being,
say in a Christian sense, in that there's an immortal soul.
Well, it's clearly
of
not
the culture.
immortal.
Well, clearly not immortal, but yeah, a mortal soul of the culture which stands apart from material reality, which he might mean. I'm inclined to think he more means it
metaphorically.
Metaphorically, in that there's some sort of function binding together the individuals who are part of a culture,
which, for lack of a better word,
and that
is a soul.
Yeah, which he describes as a soul, and that thing behaves organically in that it has a life cycle. It has definite stages within that life cycle during which it will behave in certain stereotyped ways. But you're right, he doesn't really specify actually the ultimate nature of this soul.
Yeah.
That's why people come to us though. We not merely talk about the weird aspects of these books, we are actively seeking out the weirder parts of the books to talk about.
On that note,
you come here for a very skewed view of basically everything.
On that note, it's this particular episode is about chapters 7 and 8, subtitled "Music and Plastic." There's two chapters, so 7 and 8. Chapter 7 is subtitled "The Arts of Form." What's chapter 8 called again? The Arts of Form, and we can talk about the titles. Anyways, they're about what he calls music and plastic.
Act and Portrait is the second,
and largely speaking, this is
chapter.
Spengler's exploration of different artistic forms and how they correspond. How would you say it in Spengler's language? Like they are
getting ready to make everything a lot.
They
more
are the
unclear.
becoming of the cultures. I need to figure out how to speak more Spenglerian. I think Jack, you can probably do it. Give it a go.
I think. Yes, I liked these two chapters quite a lot. These are less theoretical than the previous chapters. So he's given you a huge he's given you a lot to think about in terms of his theory up till now in the book. These two chapters are more him applying this theory mostly to the development of art and culture in the context of the West. He does mention the Egyptians and Greeks and things, mostly the Greeks, but overall it's like 80% the West, and then the Greeks are the culture and civilization mentioned next, the next most, and then all of the other ones like the Magian soul the Egyptians, etc., are mentioned much less. It's a lot of fun because he traces out the life cycle of a culture by mostly walking through the art history of the West. And it gets really weird. He analyzes so much stuff to such a degree. The specific color choices in Western oil painting. We can talk about why the Renaissance, he says, was definitely part of the Faustian soul and in no way classical. It was not a recrudescence of the classical soul in any way. For quite funny reasons, very, very Spenglerian reasons. The innovation of Titian in having visible brushstrokes in paintings, the music of Wagner, it's pretty fun. I found these ones really, really enjoyable.
So because I've had a lot on my plate recently, haven't been able to go as in depth into the material as Jack has been able to of late with Spengler. So it'll be slightly more of a Q&A between Levi as somebody with a speed run understanding of the chapters, talking to Jack as Spenglerbot. Spanglerbot 3000.
Yeah, so I will be responding as Spengler.
It's funny, even Jack took notes, and even just Jack's notes on these take up 60 pages in PDF.
The notes are pretty unwieldy, actually, for an episode. I don't know how helpful they're going to be. They're helpful for me remembering stuff. One thing, actually, so before we get into going through the timeline of Western art, Spengler starts out the music and plastic chapters by sort of defining music and plastic. So the plastic arts they're basically arts you can look at, like shaping arts, things like sculpture or painting. And music is a so-called speaking art. So it's not something that's visible. It's not visually represented. Having made this distinction, Spengler then says that this distinction is wrong, and people who make this distinction are dum-dums.
Of course, because everybody who disagrees with Spengler is a dum-dum.
This distinction separates things based on which organ perceives the outer form of whatever piece of art is being looked at. But a more meaningful distinction separates arts based on how they affect the inner senses and the imagination. And that's what Spengler cares about. And interestingly, Spengler says that this distinction is meaningful for Westerners, but not for people, for example, of the classical soul. Westerners, because of their Faustian spirit, can experience the becoming behind the actuality of any piece of art. So a piece of art is become, but Westerners, because we have this historical sense, we can look through that become facade to the becoming behind that piece of art. Whereas for the classical soul, everything was surface. And so for the classical soul, this inner sense and outer sense were just not separable.
So does he ever really explain why this is the case?
Well, earlier in the book, his method is more to offer examples of, okay, so in the distinction between the Western historical soul and the classical ahistorical soul, he offers pieces of evidence. He offers examples and says, okay, look at the particular physiognomy of classical art versus that of Western art. And from that, he infers that the Western soul is deeply historical and is one that stretches to infinity and is acutely aware of becoming, whereas the classical soul is ahistorical. It exists in a continuous mythological present and is sharply demarcated. So everything exists on a surface. It's very much a somatic soul. He gets to this point backwards from starting out with looking at the cultural output of these two souls and then saying that and then describing the inner nature of them both from that.
Yeah. Okay. So All right. So where should we start out then? It's just one of those things where it's just like you just
Thoroughly
okay. If I
convinced.
just take that for granted, rather than like
You
yeah, because
you
the
just have to
main
go along
question
with it.
is just
Because even like even anterior to that empirical method is just assuming that the Western and classical souls are
yeah,
different, and that you can divide epochs
yeah,
of history into
and
souls,
specifically
or that they're subtended by souls.
like Spangler can only make that claim if that claim is true, like um, in the first place, like
Well, you can make the claim even if it's not true and write 2 books about it.
no, what I mean is like um, he's asserting that he can make this claim as a member of the Faustian culture,
Yeah,
and that enables him to be able to perceive the truth of this claim.
yeah. I think he says that in the first chapter of this
Yeah,
book.
but like he's like assuming that he's already correct in the first place in order to
Mm.
for that logic to be able to work.
I
But yeah,
guess
if you just
I
go
guess
along with it, yeah,
part of that might also be just the way in which the book is written, in that
like the
the
style.
thinking through, well, no, or just the thinking through of why certain cultures, and when I say culture, I'm not saying this in a capital C Spenglerian sense of culture. I say it in the more general sense. When the process of thinking through how different cultures can be
Mm,
categorized happened before he finished the
mm,
book.
mm,
Like that thinking process was
mm,
before the
mm,
book.
mm, mm. Yeah. Okay. So, anyways, that's stuff that we've sort of gone over. I just can't unhook from that, but I will try to unhook and just go along for the ride for a bit. Um, okay. So, what have we got here? What have we got here? I thought his idea of plastic. Should we talk about the idea of
I reckon going through the development of the West's art and talking about that, and talking about interesting things that come up in the process of that might be a way to organize this episode, because that's roughly how these chapters are organized. There are a few things to say before setting off on this adventure that will just make some of Spengler's statements clearer. So one is that not merely the pieces of art themselves, not merely the subjects of the art, but the artistic media chosen are also expressions of a soul. So certain souls will favor certain artistic media over others. For example, the classical soul very much favored sculpture, and each culture or each soul is going to have an artistic form that ultimately expresses the soul in its totality. And for example, the classical soul, that was freestanding sculpture. You had things like fresco art, which could represent a lot of the soul, but ultimately it was only freestanding culture. And in the West, something like oil painting could express a lot of the soul or represent a lot of the Faustian soul, but it was ultimately music that could do that. And it ultimately Wagner's music. I think it was Tristan by Wagner was the thing that that Spengler said
yeah,
was the culmination of the Western soul. Like that's
the
the
peak.
that's the peak. That is the most total statement possible of the Western soul. So okay, so you've got that. Certain cultures will express themselves in certain artistic media, or certain artistic media are able to express a certain soul more effectively than others. Another thing is he says that the beginning of all sort of cultural art of a soul is architecture. That begins everything.
So, what's the relationship
And
between the different forms? Like, as you said, like architecture starts everything off.
yeah,
Does he describe the relationship between architecture and sculpture and painting and music?
yeah, he says initially for quite a while, particularly in a culture's early life or a soul's early life, almost all of the artistic output of that soul is expressed in
So that would be
architecture.
during the springtime.
In the springtime, it begins to detach. So other art forms are always beginning to pull away from architecture, and they become more and more autonomous as a soul
So
ages,
should we map this into
to the point where they completely split off. So in, for example, by the Baroque period, which is really the high period of the Faustian soul, you've had things like oil painting and music completely splitting off from architecture and no longer being architectural. And then, interestingly, by the time you get to the Rococo period, it's reversed and architecture starts becoming musical and starts imitating music.
So should we do a quick reminder of, like, you've got the seasons of the soul, right? You've got
Yeah.
the summer, spring, autumn, and winter. And so in each instance, he relates the evolution of artistic forms into one of those periods for a particular culture. So we've got like 3 tracks going on here. You've got the particular culture, so like Magian, classical, Faustian, or whatever, or Egyptian. And then within each one of those, you've got your seasons. And then within each season, or within and between each season, you've got how the different artistic forms evolve, for lack of a better word, and relate to one another. And so early on, does he start out the cycles with summer or springtime? I can't remember. He must start out with springtime. Yeah,
With springtime.
So it always starts with, in the springtime, strong architectural forms.
Yeah, or just everything is encompassed within architecture. That's the first form to really become distinct and to distinctly express a soul's inner necessity.
And so does that say, is he saying
do
that like
have-
the architecture is greatest in the springtime and then the architecture becomes less important and decays so by the time you get to the wintertime of a soul, you have like worse and worse architecture? Is he saying stuff like that?
Yeah, well, everything artistic is worse in the wintertime. Okay. It has the greatest emphasis placed on it earlier on in a soul's life. There is also, so last episode we mentioned the distinction between imitative and ornamental art. Imitative art also exists and is very, very important earlier on in a soul's life. It's just that sort of stuff doesn't get preserved because of the nature of imitative art.
So that
tends
would be
to be
like
things like spontaneous group dance or group chanting.
Roman art imitating classical or imitating Greek.
So it's less that. So imitative and ornamental art, the distinction is it's sort of that of being and becoming. So imitative art is art that tries to draw the participant into the same direction as that of becoming. So it tends to be things like group song or group chants, group dancing. It brings someone into the same. It brings someone parallel to becoming. Whereas the ornamental arts are part of the depth function of a soul, of the mathematization of space. They try to fix things into place concretely. And these are things more like architecture, painting, music that is notated.
And so
these are concrete artifacts that persist through
rather
time.
than things like
so there's
dance.
also a bias in terms of preservation towards ornamental
And so would play and theatre be imitative then?
So it'll always be a spectrum.
More or less.
It depends if it's improvised or not. So I guess you could say
comedy.
Completely improvised theatre would be much more imitative because it's imitating the becoming
Whereas
of the world around
replaying
them.
King Lear or something like reinstantiating King
it's
Lear would be ornamental. So with regards to like the period of so during the entire, whenever Jack goes to explain something, obviously you can't see it. But he's got this smile on his face as he tries to navigate and pass the concepts of Spengler in a way that is actually digestible and understandable. Jack's done an incredibly good job of like actually getting to the point where you probably do actually understand Spengler, where I can just straight up say, like, I still don't understand what the hell he's trying to get at.
The thing with Spengler, he writes in this particular way where he'll kind of tell you his one of his beliefs, and he just says it. Like, you just have to go with it. He just says one of his beliefs, and then he'll basically repeat himself in different ways. He'll just give lots and lots and lots of different examples of this one thing, and eventually your mind syncs up to his and it starts making a lot of sense, but it's quite hard to convey of what he was
Especially
saying, which might be why he wrote these books in the way that he did. It's almost like high volume pattern recognition. You're a neural net being trained on Spengler's training data, where he's just giving you all of these different examples until you pick the pattern that connects.
I actually think this text would actually be better done as a movie or something. It's quite visual. You could actually demonstrate what he's saying much better with film and show like his like Egyptian architecture and stuff, and actually show. Whereas I guess he's put in a lot of effort to try to convey this stuff in textual form. It's just very impressive. Anyways, back to the categorization of things. So can I also ask, just for a reminder of to help Dum Levi out, we've got our major souls. We've got our classical, Egyptian, Magian. What was the Magian soul again?
So the Magian soul is the soul that arose in the Middle East.
So like Arabia.
I guess around like the year 0 or thereabouts. And for quite a while it was covered over by the classical soul. So its early life it exists as pseudomorphosis. So it exists as basically classical forms animated by a different soul. So the forms, while they might exteriorly appear classical, actually signify something different.
And so then we also have Faustian. Can you explain briefly what he means by Faustian? Because he really likes that.
As in what the Faustian soul is, the constant.
Yeah. And
where would it
start historically?
9th or 10th century, I think.
Okay. And so can we also just one last little thing. What exactly, so we talk about the West, right? And this is the decline of the West. But he has a distinction between the classical soul and the Faustian soul.
Yeah.
Whereas like people might have a misconception that, they're both just the West. But they're not. Is it?
Yeah.
Is it
he
correct?
Says they're totally different.
Yeah. Is it correct to say that what he means when he says the West is like, you could retitle it The Decline of the Faustian Soul?
Yeah, yeah. So when he talks about the West, he means the Faustian soul.
Yeah.
And of the West, he mostly means Northern Europe.
Yeah.
So he does talk about Southern Europe, particularly when he talks about the Renaissance, but he mostly means Northern Europe.
And that's interesting because the Renaissance is not a part of the Faustian soul, he said, right?
Oh, it is.
It is. Okay, it is a part of the Faustian soul.
He says it's definitely part of the Faustian soul. It's just people who don't understand history think that it has some link to the classical soul, which it doesn't.
Which it doesn't.
No,
was that pseudomorphosis as well?
Not even pseudomorphosis. Do you want to talk about the Renaissance and why?
Yeah, let's talk about the Renaissance. The only reason why I was bringing up those reminders was because in each instance we can think of like, let's talk about the architectural form or the sculpture or whatever, the Magian soul. So what do we mean? Like the Arabian around the years 0. Or like Faustian, he means like Northern European modern.
Mm-hmm. He says the Renaissance was definitely part of the Faustian soul. So part of every soul's life cycle is it reaches early on a point where it comes to understand its own destiny, capital D, destiny. The soul's depth grows, and that depth imposes upon the soul and all of that soul's output a destiny. It imposes upon it things that it must do unavoidably. And a soul, upon becoming aware of this, will oftentimes have a rebellion against its destiny, where the soul as becoming begins to generate being. It actualizes being, in a way that tries to run counter to its destiny. But this is ultimately just an inevitable part of its life cycle. And Spengler says that the Renaissance is basically this doomed rebellion of the Faustian soul against itself. And this rebellion was nonetheless thoroughly Western and fundamentally different to the classical. So what is being rebelled against? So the Faustian soul has understood itself to be one that is deeply historical, that is of becoming, one that reaches for infinity, and one that seeks to dissolve body and dissolve itself into endless space.
Mm.
To rebel against this, it tries to adopt the forms of the classical soul. The classical soul being one really characterized by concrete, delimited bodies, the surface of a body. So something which doesn't dissolve itself into space, but something which is of a surface, something which has no interiority, something which is, it's almost transparent in a sense. Like everything present is on the surface.
This is the classical?
This is the classical.
Yeah, so that would come through in like their alabaster sculptures, like...
Yeah, the freestanding sculpture, which was the height of classical cultural output.
And that extends all the way into like Rome.
Yeah. And Rome being the winter of this.
Yeah.
So you've got the Faustian soul that in the Gothic period really came to understand itself and understand its depth, and it rebels against that, at least in Southern Europe in the Renaissance.
And so then he's almost creating like a meta framework through which to understand things like what we'd consider, say, the Gothic period and the Renaissance.
That's absolute. That's definitely what he's doing. That's the point of the whole book. Yeah, to set out. It's sort of to work out what these different souls do during their life cycle. So one of the things he just says is that all of these souls are of the same, I guess you'd say of the same species, in that they all have the same length of life unless they're cut short by something. And they always go through a certain number of life stages in which they predictably behave in certain ways. And these life stages last the same amount of time. And he calls these
like
stages
physical chronological time or historical achronological.
It'd be chronological time, so you can measure it in years.
Yeah. Okay.
So he'll call these different time periods contemporary if they're at the same point in a soul's life cycle. So, for example, the springtime of the Faustian soul is contemporary to the springtime of the Magian soul.
Even though chronologically they occurred at different points in
space-time. They occur at different points, but if you like line the two souls up next to each other, those the two springtimes will correspond. So when he talks about things being contemporary, he means it really, really differently to how that word is conventionally used, because it's Spengler.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the things that makes talking about Spengler hard, is because his vocabulary is highly specialized, but also, perhaps it's not the case in German, but at least in the English translation, there are a lot of words that have a conventional meaning. But he just takes those words and then changes the meaning to mean something quite different, which makes discussing it sort of difficult, or you just need to keep specifying whether you're using a word in a Spenglerian or a normal way.
I suppose in this regard, he's talking about, like, I can see what he's saying. it's just you'd be more like, it's just what's this correspondence between these two different souls. Yeah, as you said, if you were to line them up, if they happen to be coincident in chronological physical time, they would be having like their springtime at the same time, or whatever. Yeah, that's really interesting. So we should talk about some art.
Let's talk about art. I want to preface all of this. I think I mentioned this when we talked about the Futurist Manifesto, that I just do not know much about art. It's just,
I don't know anything about art.
This is not my strong suit. I like books.
I have family members who are artists, but they're all like contemporary artists. And so I just know about weird contemporary art stuff. Not like any of this stuff now we're talking about.
Not like Spengler, who, God, can you imagine what it would have been like to meet this guy?
It would have been really strange.
I bet this guy would have been able to lecture you on art for hours and hours, just off the top of his
cuff.
head.
Yeah.
But he had multiple layers, so he could have done the conventional art history lecture, or he could have given you the Spengler special where he starts talking about souls and pseudomorphosis and seasons of the soul and things like that.
He was a very creative person, wasn't he, in his own strange little way?
This is a deeply, deeply creative work of history, and I don't mean that as an insult.
No.
I mean this is really high praise.
When I was walking home this morning from the cafe, I was thinking about actually this episode and how I don't think there's anything fundamental. So there's this idea of like children have what's sometimes called magical thinking, you know, like in believing in Santa or whatever, or like having imaginary friends and stuff. But I don't think, and I was listening to this one educator, like educational philosopher. He was saying like there's not any meaningful distinction between the magical thinking of kids and the magical thinking of adults, but really what's happening is that adults have we've evolved like culturally the ability to constrain that magical thinking. And so like science, for example, being like the highest form of it, where we're constraining it by intensely rigorous empirical tests and that sort of stuff. But it's still magical. Like it's still a magical thing. Like in order to really understand something as like bizarre as say like time dilation, you have to like sit down and try to imagine really strange scenarios that you actually never experience yourself. And so in the case of somebody like Spengler, or a lot of the people that we've read on this podcast, I actually think there's something like deeply interesting about like these people are exhibiting the same magical thinking, but they've changed the constraints that they're using to like shape what their thinking is, and it leads them to totally different outcomes with like the model of the world in their head.
And that's a really good way of putting it, because as we've noted probably on every Spengler episode, there is some sort of similarity between him and Evola, not in terms of the contents of their thought, but as you said, they'll both set out constraints on their thinking, which at least to my mind seem somewhat arbitrary, but they'll set out constraints on their thinking, but then both of them are rigorous enough that they just follow those constraints through to their logical conclusion and make these highly internally consistent alternate models of the world, which I find really fun to inhabit. I'm not sure how generalizable that is, but it's just such a strange experience.
And that's why you can have that sense of like internal truth to the thing, internal correspondence.
If you don't step outside of the Spengler boundary
they've laid down,
it makes sense.
And I guess the only reason why I find it hard is because I'm a degenerate modern. But I always ask, like, as we've just said before, like, why? Like, why do you have this constraint? I almost feel as though like what's happened is they've like Spengler, both Spengler and Evola, they've sometimes they explicitly say one of the constraints or one of the first principles, and sometimes I feel like there's also a lingering first principle which maybe they're not aware of, and they haven't said it because maybe they haven't realized it themselves, articulated it themselves, but it's in there in the background and they're not breaking it. And it's interesting to see they take these models to their logical extreme and apply them in very strange ways, like with art and stuff.
I guess in the case of the two of Spengler and Evola and a number of others we've read for this podcast, I can very confidently say that I enjoy the things they've written from almost an artistic or an aesthetic perspective
point of view. That
they've set out their own constraints, followed them, and by tightly following the contours of those constraints have generated something genuinely interesting.
And they're in their vast knowledge of different cultures. Yeah.
Yeah, they're both smart
Very
enough,
erudite.
erudite enough, and just autistic enough to fully actualize that system of constraints
into like 1100-page treatises. Like, how many books did fucking Evola write? Like 30 books or something.
Oh, he wrote like high 20s, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Of talking about like sex magic and revolt against the modern world. And
so yeah, they were very inspired by so it's interesting because it's good to, I think, sometimes Levi's meta framework of like humans creating knowledge is that, like, roughly speaking, we have to discover the constraints and the things that, and the criterion by which we're judging a model. But like, if somebody comes along with totally different criteria and constraints and so forth, then they still might be rational within that system of constraints. But because you disagree with those constraints and those criteria, you're going to like talk past one another.
Yeah. I mean, you and I both will be operating with a large number of unexamined constraints on our thinking.
Yeah, 100%.
That we're simply not aware of.
And then clashing with somebody like Spengler.
Yeah. Who's just inhabiting almost a different rational framework to us.
Yeah. And then also just writes just terribly.
His writing is very German.
Yeah, very intense.
I don't know what it might just be a function of how the German language works, in that it supports being able to make new words that are commonly understood very, very easily.
Yeah.
But yeah, at least when it's translated into English, a lot of Germans write in this way that, at least in English, is really, really clunky. Just because in English, representing those neologisms doesn't work because of how the language functions.
Yeah, true.
I anticipate that's mostly actually just because of how the German language works.
Yeah, how easy it is. I saw this German guy trying to explain in English how making new words is much easier in German. Which I didn't understand. I was like, oh, well, that's weird.
Yeah. Shout out to Yarp and Hans and Maestro, our German contingent.
So, should we... Anyways, that was
the
a
Renaissance.
Nice detour into stuff. Yeah, the Renaissance. Should we talk about the architectural styles, the art, the music?
Yeah.
So the Renaissance as a reaction to the destiny of the Faustian soul.
Yeah, he says if you really look at the Renaissance with an eye to see, you will clearly discern that it is actually just purely Faustian. It's not remotely classical. Why is this? Well, I've got some examples here. So, Renaissance architecture emphasized the facade, and the facade of a building is stylistically connected to the interior. So, it admits of an interiority, whereas classical buildings attempted to deny interiority altogether. So, they were made up of columns, and with the columns, the inside is continuous with the outside. There's no hidden interior. Everything is surface. As well as that, when you look at sculpture in the Florentine Renaissance, so he says probably the one way in which the Florentine Renaissance was similar to the classical world was that sculpture was the preeminent art form. Very, very brief, but it was the preeminent art form in the Florentine Renaissance. However, classical sculpture was freestanding, or at least it aspired to be freestanding. But Florentine sculpture, I quote, feels behind it the ghost of the niche into which the Gothic sculptor had built its real ancestors. So Gothic sculpture existed within niches. So, for example, within hollows of the wall of a church. And Spengler says you can see this in Florentine Renaissance sculpture as well. And that's totally unclassical. Classical sculpture could be viewed from wherever, whereas Florentine sculpture exists to be viewed from a certain perspective in a certain place. Also, and this is the most damning piece of evidence against the Renaissance being considered of the classical soul, and he brings this up so many times. Fucking Spengler and columns. It's anyone who's read Spengler will know what we mean when we say that he just loves columns. He does not stop talking about columns and the importance of columns. So, Renaissance round arches join directly to columns, which is not classical in the slightest because it's a continuous line. It has nothing classical about it. The classical mind could not comprehend joining columns to an arch.
To arches.
When we use examples of joining columns to an arch and say it's classical, it's wrong. That's a Magian pseudomorphosis. That's not classical. The classical soul was dead by the time that started happening. This is a Magian motif. All right?
It's Magian.
Have you got that? You piece of shit. You fucko.
If anybody wants to fucking debate this, take it up. Take it up with Jack. No, the classical soul was dead by Florence.
He unironically uses this as a piece of evidence to dismiss the claim that the Renaissance was classical. When the classical uses what they thought were the Renaissance uses what they thought were classical arches, what they're actually imitating is they're taking the external form of the classical pseudomorphosis used by Magians and animating it with a Faustian spirit in Florence. Naturally.
Okay, wait, sorry. They're taking a Magian pseudomorphosis.
Yeah.
And animating it with a Faustian spirit.
So what happened? So you had the Magian soul arising underneath sort of the ossified remains, the sloughed off actualities of the now dead classical soul.
But how's that Faustian?
The Magian soul arose in that context. And the pseudomorphosis is that the Magian soul took these forms that it saw in the world around it, so of dead classical actualities, and started using that form language to express itself. So the Magian soul was expressing itself, but using the forms of the classical soul that it saw. And so you had things that were maybe in appearance that had some visual similarity to the classical soul or actualities of the classical soul, but were animated by a different principle. Hence why you had round arches joined to columns, which was unclassical. That's a Magian thought, but the Magian soul was expressing itself using these classical forms and twisting them.
But I thought the Renaissance was Faustian. How does the Faustian?
And exactly. So what the Faustian Renaissance did is it saw these arches joined to columns, which were actually Magian, but because it has no understanding of the classical, it said, that's classical. We're going to imitate that because we are classical as well. So it demonstrates the fundamental disconnect.
What? So it's the Faustians imitating...
It's the Faustians imitating the pseudomorphosis by the Magians of the classical. Yeah.
And they're mistaken. So basically because the Faustian soul was trying to rebel. It was trying to rebel against its own destiny.
Yeah, you can't tell me what to do, mum. It's saying to the Gothic Faustian self-understanding of its own destiny. Because once a soul understands its destiny, implicit in that is the soul's death.
Yes.
It sees that it inevitably will end, and it rebels against that.
It's like death terror.
The ratty teenage rebellion of the Faustian soul was the Florentine Renaissance. And it looked for something in the past to identify itself with, to try to deny that coming death.
Interpretation of Spengler.
Yeah, but it demonstrated its complete lack of understanding of the classical by picking something that was fundamentally unclassical and calling it classical.
Such as an arch joining to a column.
Yeah. All of this is Spengler looking at an arch joining to columns.
He just never stopped to think like there's a lot of cultural output, and even as erudite as he might have been, he still only has the throughput capabilities of a single person to absorb enough information to make such a an intense, not intense, as a definitive
categorical
claim
acclaim.
and interpretation of the Magian soul pseudomorphosis of the classical soul being used by the Faustian soul to rebel against its own destiny. Like he extracted that out of arches joining to columns.
My read on Spengler is that he was very, very smart. I'm pretty sure he was quite socially isolated when he was writing this, and he must have just gotten a real kick out of his own intellectual fireworks, just being able to draw connections between lots and lots of things. And he did it to the point where he didn't stop and ask, do I need to be making these connections? He just wanted to be connecting things.
Or he might have even thought as like some sort of divine inspiration. You know, like, have you ever had this moment? I've had this moment where I was like, wow, that was really smart. Just stoner thoughts, perhaps. Like, oh, wow, that's really smart. And like the next day I think, wow, that was really dumb. That was a really dumb idea. Like it seemed smart in the moment.
Spengler never stopped.
Yeah, Spengler was like intoxicated on his own ability to make these connections and never really thought, okay, well, maybe there's not as much there as I thought. He just said, this is the, what did he call it? The Copernican revolution of history.
Yeah.
So what about, there's a note here that says painting. There's some stuff about, I don't know if you just want to vibe on this. The great Faustian style lived between roughly 1500 and 1800.
Yeah, we can talk about that. This is fun. This is a lot of fun.
Okay. So Spengler says that the great Faustian style is fundamentally musical.
Yeah.
Culminating in instrumental orchestral music that completely dissolved body and spatiality. So there's a quote here. At the beginning, in the 17th century, music uses the characteristic tone colors of the instruments and the contrasts of strings and wind, human voices and instrumental voices as means wherewith to paint. It's quite unconscious. Ambition is to parallel the great masters from Tide to Velasquez and Rembrandt. So what is he saying there? Because this might be quite confusing, but in fact, you can paint with music, and you can use music to create, and you can paint with you can use music to create paintings.
Yeah. So this is going back to what we were saying earlier about how Spengler says that some people make the distinction between various artistic forms on the basis of how they appear to the external senses. So
which
separating, say, visual arts, so things like painting or sculpture, from things like music. And he says this is wrong. What we should be doing is looking at how they influence the inner sense. And so in this way, Western music and Western oil painting affect the inner sense in the same way.
Yeah.
I guess this brings up...
It's actually quite an interesting idea, though.
This is later in the second music and plastic chapter, but it's probably worth bringing up now. It's also quite annoying because it makes talking about Spengler more difficult because, again, it affixes a new meaning to an existing word that has a predefined meaning. His idea of Impressionism, and when I say Impressionism, I don't mean the French artistic movement. Impressionism for Spengler means something quite different. So Impressionism is a specifically Faustian way of looking at art. It's a way of looking at how does art affect the inner sense and examining the way in which art affects the inner sense. Impressionism for Spengler is broadly the Faustian approach to art. after oil painting, in which the artist uses the actuality of their art. So that is the concrete manifestation of their art, say the painting or their music, how the music sounds, how the painting looks, to force a phenomenology or an impression upon the beholder. And this art is the complete opposite of plastic art. So plastic art being this concrete art, something like a sculpture for a classical beholder who will only see the sculpture's surface and everything is in that surface. Whereas the impressionist approach to art evokes the impressions of one experiencing the world. It addresses itself directly to someone's interiority. I quote, Impressionism is the comprehensive expression of a world feeling, and it must obviously therefore permeate the whole physiognomy of our late culture. There is an impressionistic mathematic which frankly and with intent transcends all optical limitations. It is analysis, as developed after Newton and Leibniz, and to it belong the visionary images of number bodies, aggregates, and the multidimensional geometry. There is again an impressionistic physics which sees, in lieu of bodies, systems of mass points, units that are evidently no more than constant relations between variable efficients. There are impressionistic ethics, tragedy, and logic, and even, in pietism, an impressionistic Christianity. This impressionism extends to every artifact of Faustian culture.
I actually genuinely think this was one of the more interesting points. This idea,
Yeah, this was definitely one of the most interesting bits.
and to be fair, this might be one of the few places where I'd actually give Spengler like, actually, that would be a useful way to think through, like
I think this has
categorizing
high
art.
correspondence to reality.
Yeah, because you could see even that's what the say like we recently read the Futurist Manifesto, where they were obsessed with speed and they didn't care that they were expressing the phenomenological um, essence of speed through sculpture, which some of their sculptures are really amazing, the Futurists, or whether they are doing it through painting, oil paintings, or music, or like the form of a car and the way that a car can look fast. They were just like obsessed with speed and expressing that the spirit of speed in different artistic forms.
Yeah, yeah.
So I actually think that in this regard,
Like,
Spengler was actually onto something.
yeah, exactly. Because the futurists weren't expressing something literally going quickly. They weren't just showing you a fast moving object. They were showing you, for example, a painting that gives the interior sensation of speed.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So I actually
So
thought this was a really interesting point. Like,
yeah,
disregard the surface, what sort of like physical form it has. Like, look at its
yeah.
phenomenological category. Yeah,
And I brought that up because of what you said about how at least in the Faustian soul, as the Faustian soul ages, everything becomes more musical. I see that as
and so
sort of a
musical, he
different way
means
of
like
Spengler expressing
movement.
this idea that the physical medium with which you evoke certain impressions is important. Certain media lend themselves better to expressing or certain impressions than others, but ultimately the end point that you really should be focusing on is what impression is evoked. In which case,
The
oil
impression.
painting
Yeah,
and music can both be said to be musical, or
yeah,
Rococo architecture can be said to be musical because it's ultimately aiming at the same impression.
or like a different thing could be like sculptural or something.
Mm, mm. I agree with you. That's the impressionism stuff is probably the most interesting part of these two chapters.
Yeah, and so with regards to what were you saying before? Impressionist.
Yeah.
So okay, so let's zoom in on that a little bit because
Hmm.
he's very, as you noted in, I think one of the quotes and during your explanation. How can we? How do I phrase this question? Why is it the case that impressionism across different artistic forms? How come that is the key impression style of the Faustian soul? What is it about the Faustian soul that wants to um, emanate impressionism into the world. If that's the right way to put it. I struggle to like form these questions probably, but yeah, that's, you see what I'm trying to get at, right?
Yeah. I think it could be in part because of the nature of the Faustian soul, how the Faustian soul is striving towards an infinity of endless bodiless space. So the dissolution of the body in space. And we can talk about how this is represented in art later, because that part of these chapters is quite a lot of fun. So I guess a pure sensation of whatever impression is being represented, or whatever that pure sensation, that impression evoked by some concrete piece of art, is in some sense bodiless, as opposed to, for example, a classical sculpture which has sort of it has itself fully embodied. So the fully embodied classical sculpture versus the bodiless impression evoked by Faustian art. Also is the Faustian focus on becoming and the historical, as opposed to the classical focus on being and body. So Faustian art, any individual instance of art, is by necessity being. It's actualized, unchanging being.
Yeah.
Insofar as it's ornamental art. But the key distinction between, for example, a classical sculpture, which doesn't represent anything beyond itself, its surface is everything. It is the pure surface present. Whereas a Faustian piece of art, even though it concretely, in a physical sense, is still being, it's still an unchanging piece of art, what makes it truly Faustian is that it represents and evokes a sense of becoming. So when we can talk about Titian, he says Titian and the Venetians' great innovation in the 16th century was that Titian began to paint with visible brush strokes, and these visible brush strokes, even though obviously the brush strokes themselves are fixed in place, like they're not moving, but what they do is they represent the process of painting the picture, of motion. So they make the painting historical in that they represent to the Faustian viewer the becoming that went into creating the painting, and in that way are of becoming. So they evoke that impression. I think that's what drives the Faustian impetus towards impressionism.
Yeah.
I could also be completely wrong. Like I guess I'm taking a Spenglerian approach to this, of just trying to draw associations between all the different things he said.
Obsession with the infinite dissolution of attachment to corporeal space objects.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's, and so in that respect, it's highly musical, to use Spengler's word.
Yeah,
it's highly musical, or is it highly plastic?
Not plastic at all.
Not plastic. It's musical. Whereas, what would be to compare? What would be a culture and artistic form that is plastic?
So he compares the Faustian and classical souls a lot because he sees them as deeply, deeply different. So the
classical would be
classical
plastic.
soul, is very much of plastic. So it expressed itself best in plastic arts. So things like fresco painting, and then particularly freestanding sculpture.
This is a wild ride.
It's a wild ride. These two chapters are probably my favorite ones of the book so far. They're really fun.
You've got here a quote: in the context of the West, so the Faustian soul, the cathedral is music and the castle makes music. What does he mean by that?
Oh, yeah.
How can architecture be musical?
So architecture, it can be musical in the same way that oil painting can be musical, in that it evokes an impression of bodiless infinity and of becoming in one viewing it.
Yeah. So it's back to that.
It's phenomenological. So it's not
impression.
That it in itself is a it's not noumenly.
No, it
changing. It's
evokes
not of becoming. It's what it evokes in phenomenology.
the Gothic cathedral evokes a sense of infinite transcendence in the
Yeah,
person partaking in building or like viewing the cathedral.
yeah, and it's I'm pretty sure the quote you read out is also relating to him talking about the distinction between imitative and ornamental art. How it was the
Yep.
countryside, the manor, the nobility were much more of the imitative side of things. So they were imitating being, trying to go with the direction. Of becoming, trying to go with the direction of becoming. Whereas the church, the cathedral, were much more of being. So they were concretizing things, making things ornamental, concretizing these things that instead of bringing you in the direction of becoming, evoked feelings of becoming in the viewer in an impressionistic sense.
Mm. Interesting.
People can't see Levi's thinking face, and he's getting slammed with these things.
It's like that galaxy brain meme. I feel like science is just like little pea brain, and then
Yeah.
Evola is like a little bit more galaxy brain, and then
Evola's
Spengler is
bigger.
like big galaxy brain,
And then
okay?
losing your mind over columns connected to arches
is like
galaxy
full blown.
brain.
One of my favorite memes of all time is the meme of what was that? Tim and Eric, like mind being blown in their little like black turtleneck jumpers, like that's Levi's mind being blown about like
on Spengler
columns, columns and arches, refuting the claim that the Renaissance was classical.
Oh, perspective and colors. Oh, let's go into perspective and colors. This is where he analyzes particularly oil painting, or not just oil painting, painting in general, a very unique way. It's very, very unique. So, in the context of perspective, it's kind of, I was going to say it's kind of obvious what Faustians would think. If you're familiar with Spengler, it's obvious what
Faustians,
would think about perspective. So perspective is a representation of space. Therefore, it's a representation of a person's depth experience. And when I say depth experience, I mean this in a Spenglerian sense. So a soul, as it matures, develops a sense of depth, and that depth is almost a filter through which experience is passed and then organized and ordered and mathematized. It's made natural. And the prime symbol, so this thing that is inherent in a culture's depth, leads to different expressions of perspective for different cultures. For example, Egyptian depth was that of a long corridor. So it had a great deal of length along one axis and was extremely constrained along all other axes. The depth of the classical soul was extremely limited, intentionally limited to a concrete surface. And anything that not merely lay outside of it, but hinted at an existence outside of that all-encompassing surface could potentially let in chaos and just destroy everything. And then you have the Faustian sense of distance or of perspective, which is that of infinity and trying to lead to a bodiless infinity. And something that tried to destroy any sense of surface, completely dissolve it. One way in which this was done, so, you had things like, you had Gothic architecture, which reached for infinity with really high ceilings and things like that, and gave the strong impression of space. But that's still not the highest possible Faustian art form, because it's still, just by nature of the medium itself, of architecture, it's still very embodied. The two art forms that most effectively express the Faustian soul are oil painting, which is sort of the secondary one. The primary one is music. So while oil painting, particularly with its use of color and with visible brush strokes, can go a very long way towards representing the dissolution of body and surface in infinity. Music, as it simply has no body at all, is the greatest vehicle for expressing the Faustian spirit, because it doesn't just represent the dissolution of surface and body, it has no body.
Mm. Mm.
It's pure changing becoming.
Mm.
But to get to that point, we should talk about colors, because he's got this chapter on colors where he goes into a lot of detail on colors. It's section 8 of Music and Plastic.
Yeah.
Okay, he says yellow and red are foreground colors, and they represent the plastic body, because I guess you just have to accept that plastic body is equivalent to foreground. He just says it is. It just is.
Yeah.
Blue, green, and studio brown are the background colors of space. So space and background are associated. Surface, body, and foreground are associated. As such, the colors yellow and red are very much favored by classical artists. And as the Faustian soul develops and grows more mature, the colors of blue, green, and studio brown, which are transcendent and spiritual, representing space, loneliness, time, and destiny, they come more to the fore. He says that the high classical arts avoided blue and blue-green, as these colors symbolize a space exterior to the body, which the classical soul wanted to deny. He says, of course, say, classical craft arts might have blues and greens, but the high sacred art of the classical soul avoided these colors. Here we go. Him talking about the importance of blue and green, particularly when it comes to representing the distance and the horizon in Western art. I quote, "Blue and green are the colours of the heavens, the sea, the fruitful plain, the shadow of the southern noon, the evening, the remote mountains. They are essentially atmospheric and not substantial colours. They are cold, they disembody, and they evoke impressions of expanse and distance and boundlessness. An infinitesimal blue to green is the space-creating element throughout the history of our perspective oil painting, from the Venetians right into the 19th century. It is the basic and supremely important tone which supports the ensemble of the intended colour effect, as the basso continuo supports the orchestra. It is not the full, gorgeous, and familiar green that Raphael and Dürer sometimes, and seldom at that, use for draperies, but an indefinite blue-green of 1,000 nuances into white and grey and brown." So
yes, Oswald.
yeah.
Yeah.
So what they do, so you've got blue-green, mysterious, non-sensual blue-green, which to the Faustian represents infinity. And what they do is they take this color and then also bring in studio brown. What studio brown lets the painters do is it lets them express light, shade, perspective, depth without the use of lines. So the line is still something that represents a surface and a body. What studio brown and blue green allow oil painters to do is it allows them to express scenes while denying body. So you don't have any, he calls them sensual lines. Sensual meaning it suggests itself to sort of plastic senses, to a sense of concrete body. And using these colors, Faustian oil paintings were able to deny the body and evoke the impression of boundless, infinite space in those beholding them. One thing I like also, he talks about the use of gold in Magian art. So he says gold's not a color, it's a metallic representation of something outside of nature. So it denies the body, but it also denies the world outside of the cavern. For people who, it's been a few weeks since we released a Spengler episode, people who've forgotten, the Magian soul's prime symbol is the cavern. So you have space within the cavern, and outside of the cavern, either nothing exists or is there is something outside of nature and to an extent unknowable beyond the cavern. And gold represents this. I've got a good quote here actually where he compares the use of colors in the classical Western and Magian souls. Is quite fun. I quote, "In this instance, we can study the soul of three cultures working upon very similar tasks in very dissimilar ways. The Apollonian culture recognized as actual only that which was immediately present in time and space, and thus is repudiated the background as pictorial element. The Faustian strove through all sensuous barriers towards infinity, and it projected the center of gravity of the pictorial idea into the distance by means of perspective. The Magian felt all happening as an expression of mysterious powers that filled the world cavern with their spiritual substance, and it shut off the depicted scene with a gold background, that is, by something that stood beyond and outside all nature colours. Gold is not a colour. As compared with simple yellow, it produces a complicated sense impression through the metallic diffuse refulgence that is generated by its glowing surface. The metallic gleam, which is practically never found in natural conditions, is unearthly. The gleaming gold takes away from the scene the life and body, their substantial being." Which, can you just imagine occupying this guy's subjectivity as he walks through an art gallery?
I actually think he'd probably be one of the most fun people to go on like an art excursion with. Not necessarily for the truth content of what he's saying,
No,
but
for
just
him.
for the fun, just for like, let's go on a day trip to the local art gallery, Oswald, and you just tell us about what's going on. I think it genuinely would have been pretty wild. But I think I'd probably have to have like a gummy or something before.
Take the edge off his ranting.
I've got to say, it's extremely interesting. Don't know. Just like, I don't know how to put this exactly, but as far as I am aware, like humans are really the only animals that like have this obsession with symbols. Like other animals signal, they'll like dance, or like there's a really interesting species of fish that creates this like very intricate pattern in the sand, and they use that to signal to mates, like their, for whatever reason, like their fitness, their sexual fitness or whatever, within that species. So I suppose there's symbolism within other species that's very like constrained to that species. Whereas humans have this thing where we're like obsessed with symbols. And even something like, look at the US $1 bill. It's got the Eye of Horus on it or some shit. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean? What's the meaning of this? But then you've got people like Spengler who just take it to the next level. It's just like completely symbol obsessed. Like, there's meaning in everything. And in particular, I found his idea of the symbol for a particular culture, the prime symbol for a particular culture, as like, I don't know where he got it from, but it's a fascinating idea. And you have this like one animating symbol around which the other symbols rotate.
And it's almost, because he says that the prime symbol, it is itself a representation. So when we talk about the Magian cavern, the soul doesn't literally have a cavern in it. It's more, the concept of the cavern is meant to evoke in you a feeling for what the depth experience of the Magian soul is.
Yeah. Yes.
The prime symbol itself symbolizes the depth experience of a culture.
Surely this wouldn't make sense to anybody except people who have read Spengler.
Even with these episodes, so we're spending a lot of time on Spengler, I'm still not convinced that you can really grok Spengler unless you've actually sat down and bulldozed through his books.
I certainly feel that way. Okay, so what about color preferences? No, gone over that.
What about we go to act and portrait?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Act and portrait.
Yeah.
Pull up my notes.
So this is Music and Plastic 2 is act and portrait. There's chapter 8. Separating what act and portrait means. So in German, apparently the word act means a pose or a nude in the context of art in quite a broad sense. Spengler, however, uses it to mean something different. He means an expression of the instantaneous become as opposed to the historical becoming. So that's what he means when he says act.
So like dynamism, movement-oriented things. Not necessarily movement. No, yeah, movement.
Well,
yeah, like
the act, it's something frozen. It's something frozen in place. So a classical sculpture, for example,
yes,
is act because the classical sculpture, one, it denies the historical by virtue of the fact that it is of the classical soul, but also it's not individual and it doesn't express an individual's uniqueness. So Spengler says that with classical sculptures, for example, they tended to have a handful of stereotyped forms. Like you had, this is the general sculpture, and this is the political leader sculpture, and this is the poet sculpture, this is the playwright sculpture. And you'll have an individual person who'll fit into one of those roles. So, okay, you might have someone who is a general, and they will have a sculpture made of them. The sculpture might not actually look like them, but it is the general sculpture. It is a sculpture for generals. Or you might have someone who's a poet. The sculpture won't necessarily look like them, but it is the poet sculpture. So, in that sense, those sculptures are acts rather than portraits. And he compares this to the Faustian soul, which doesn't really tend to make acts so much as portraits. Everything is a portrait. Everything is historical and an autobiographical examination of a person's interiority. And in that sense, I think that's actually, there are a lot of examples he gives. I think that's the...
What was your favorite example? What was your favorite example?
Okay, how about this? This is another demonstration as to why the Renaissance was Faustian and not classical. He really, really likes this theme. He seems quite personally wounded by the suggestion that the Renaissance is anything but Faustian, because he spends a lot of time on this. And he keeps coming back to it. So, I quote, "The fall of draperies was meant in Athens to reveal the sense of the body, in the north to conceal it." Oh, and as an aside, when he talks about the north, he means the classical soul, the Faustian soul. So the north is basically analogous to the Western or the Faustian. "The fall of draperies was meant in Athens to reveal the sense of the body, in the north to conceal it. In the one case, the fabric becomes body, in the other, it becomes music. And from this deep contrast springs the silent battle that goes on in high Renaissance work between the consciously intended and the unconsciously insistent ideals of the artist. A battle in which the first, anti-Gothic, often wins the superficial, but the second, Gothic becoming Baroque, invariably wins the fundamental victory." So this is act versus portrait in that the fall of draperies over a sculpture in Athens was act. It was a surface that represented nothing beyond it being a surface that contained everything within it.
Just like so much meaning to be found in every little thing.
In everything. Whereas in the Renaissance, in Renaissance sculptures, the fall of draperies over a body, it's portrait because it actually in an impressionistic sense, it evokes in the person viewing it a sense of history, a sense of biography of whoever is being depicted, a deep individuality, which is of becoming. Being Spengler must have been exhausting. Just this much meaning being written across everything would have just been so tiring. I think as a heuristic, you can think of the act as a body or an instant or of actualized being, and you can think of portrait as history or becoming.
Could we compare and contrast some major artists? Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo.
We could.
Are there any other?
Because Spengler actually does that too, at length. Yeah, so that the three giants of the Renaissance, he says, were Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael. And he in a very Faustian way, offers portraits of all of them, talks about their interiority, their destiny. And I found this part quite interesting. So Michelangelo, he considered to be a really tragic figure, as this person who he really wanted to pursue classical plastic, but just couldn't. No matter what, his attempts to capture the classical always came out deeply Faustian. And he used classical methods like fresco and sculpture, but everything expressed using those classical methods was still Faustian. And as he got older, his works became more musical. When he says more musical, I assume he means having a greater and greater sense of becoming and bodilessness in an impressionistic sense. And with Michelangelo, sculpture ended for the Western soul. He exhausted sculpture's internal possibilities. He actualized all of them within the Faustian context. And after him, there was simply nothing more to be said in sculpture.
So all other culture after Michelangelo is just like pseudomorphosis, or is it like just the dregs or something?
It's not pseudomorphosis. So if you're a Faustian after Michelangelo doing sculpture, the sculpture lacks any sort of inner necessity. So in terms of the structure of the soul, presumably it has finite resources that can be dedicated to an individual art form. And I guess Michelangelo just ran the tank empty. And after that, there's no more soul support or soul juice to put into sculpture.
And so does that mean like the sculpture
all sculpture afterwards is barren and devoid of inner necessity?
Does that also mean it's like low quality then as well? Is that maybe?
How Spengler talks about these things is interesting. How he talks about how you can have different levels of skill in a person, but that skill will be expressed differently at different stages of a soul's life cycle. So, for example, if you take two people who are of average talent in a given artistic medium, so say we'll just take the Faustian soul. So you take someone who is a painter of average talent. If they are in the Baroque period, which is really the spring to summertime of the Faustian soul, it's at its highest point. The soul actually provides this tradition and inner necessity that animates artwork with deep power and deep symbolism. So even if you're just an average painter, but you happen to have been born during the Baroque, you'll be effortlessly creating these masterpieces. Whereas if you're born later, if you're born, say, in 1900, you don't have that support of the soul or of capital C culture to animate your art, and you can work really, really hard, but you're not going to produce much that's very good. It's interesting. He talks about how
really interesting
how Wagner he compared Wagner and Haydn. So he said that Haydn, because he was in the Baroque period, he seemed so effortless in what he was creating. He was creating all of this music effortlessly, whereas Wagner, even though Wagner was a genius, Wagner had to strain, and you can feel that strain in his music because he didn't have the support of a soul behind him in nearly the same way that Haydn did or Bach did. So I find that interesting too, the relationship between the stage of the soul and individual's talent and the artistic output of an individual. I guess that goes some way to answering your question.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it does.
You look so unsure. Spengler. Yeah. Okay. So Leonardo. So Michelangelo, he ran the tank empty on the plastic arts in the Faustian context, on sculpture. So Michelangelo was he was backwards looking. He was a Faustian genius who was looking back to the classical and trying to make classical art, but no matter what, he just kept making Faustian art. Raphael sits between the two in that his paintings are still, they're Faustian, but in an intermediate stage. So he's the last, at least in Spengler's telling, great Faustian painter who still painted surfaces. So he's the master of line. He uses line. Spengler calls it a drawing style. He uses line to express sensuous surfaces. And then after Raphael, you have people like Titian, whom I mentioned before, who has I think Michelangelo said that Titian couldn't draw, meaning that Titian no longer was representing surfaces with lines. Instead, he was using visible brush strokes. He was moving towards a more impressionistic style. And then the final of the big three of the Florentine Renaissance is Leonardo. So you've got Michelangelo looking back. You've got Raphael occupying this intermediate stage of Faustian painting. And then you've got Leonardo who's looking forwards. Leonardo was a painter of interiority and space. And he dissolved everything into one endless expanse. Unlike Raphael, for example, who painted concrete places. And it's also Leonardo wasn't tied to surface, for example, in the same way that Michelangelo tried to be. I quote, "When Leonardo studied anatomy, it was not, as in Michelangelo's case, foreground anatomy, the topography of human surfaces, studied for the sake of plastic, but physiology, studied for the inward secrets." One of the funnier parts of this section is so apparently Leonardo didn't finish quite a large number of projects he started. He has lots and lots of unfinished paintings. Spengler comes in with it's just like I would never have thought of this. He comes in with a really unexpected justification as to why this was the case. So he says that Leonardo basically came up against the limits of the possibilities of painting in the time in which he lived. So he uses the example of the Adoration of the Magi, which is an unfinished painting of Leonardo's that Spengler says is one of his masterpieces because it so clearly shows the Faustian spirit straining against its current constraints of body and I guess of painting technology. He says the work is unfinished because the forms available to Leonardo in Renaissance Florence couldn't express the Faustian feeling that Leonardo had interiorly. Yeah, he left it at the Studio Brown stage, at the stage of colors that express depth and infinity without line, and didn't advance beyond that. And I quote, "Only Leonardo was great enough to experience this limitation as a destiny. His soul was lost afar in the future, though his mortal part, his eye and hand, obeyed the spirit of the age." I really like that Leonardo's genius is exemplified in his unfinished paintings.
Yeah, and it is it's a stretch. It's a stretch, but if I stretch, I can see what he's talking about.
But it's a really fun
It's
stretch.
a really fun stretch where it's like, okay, so the adoration of the Magi is beautiful, but then because he didn't finish the coloring and it's still brown, he just left the base layers without finishing off the colors. Therefore, he's hit the upper limit of what's like possible within the cultural context.
Well, it's less that and more. He began painting it with Studio Brown,
Yeah.
and then came to the realization that within the existing repertoire of, I guess, of painting technology, of the things, of the techniques and materials available to him, he could get no closer to expressing the Faustian destiny than he could with simply Studio Brown. So he stopped, because any further alteration to the painting would make it a less perfect expression of Faustian
So
destiny.
he hit the technological limit of the ability to express the Faustian destiny.
Yeah.
So do you think Leonardo would have put it that way himself?
I would be very surprised if he did.
It's a very specific interpretation of Leonardo da Vinci's work. I don't know if you could come up with that interpretation in any other framework. I think you have to. There's no convergence in this between Spengler and any other philosopher. You could only arrive at that interpretation of the adoration of the Magi if you were coming from a Spenglerian analysis.
Yeah. The Decline of the West is truly a Spenglerian self-portrait. It's autobiographical in a Faustian sense, in that it perfectly captures the interiority of Oswald Spengler. I enjoy this book more and more because while I just don't agree with a bunch of stuff he says in it, it's a very beautiful work in that he just comes up with an internally consistent system. He just follows a bunch of constraints he's decided on to their logical endpoint, no matter how ridiculous. I think that's why I enjoy this so much.
What's interesting, though, is that surely there is another interpretation of the adoration of the Magi that is consistent with his framework, but he only proposes one. Like maybe there is another way to say like that is consistent with Spengler's point of view of that work. But he doesn't propose it. I'd like to see like some neo-Spenglerians offer new and improved interpretations of the body of work of Leonardo da Vinci that goes beyond goes beyond Oswald.
There are some neo-Spenglerians. I think it's Francis Parker Yockey, I think that's how it's pronounced, who was heavily inspired by Spengler and basically wrote like neo-fascist works, like trying to apply Spengler's ideas to neo-fascism.
What do you reckon the overlap is between neo-fascism and neo-Spenglerism? Spenglerianism.
A lot. People with fascist sympathies tend to like Spengler, which is interesting, given that Spengler, I'm pretty sure, regarded a lot of elements of fascism as degenerate and just evidence of the degradation of the West. I get the impression that sometimes people who don't like liberalism like Spengler because he also didn't like it, even though he disliked it for very different reasons to, I imagine, why they dislike it.
Yeah.
Demonstrates why the enemy of my enemy is my friend doesn't necessarily make sense.
Yeah. How interesting.
So, we've already kind of mentioned that the Baroque era, starting around 1550, was the culmination of Western art. That this is the summer point of the Faustian soul. And this is where oil painting is still going well because there's just so much capital C culture backing it up. But music really takes center stage as the Faustian art form, and increasingly does so because painted arts can evoke an ideal, but they're ultimately illusions. They're ultimately representations of infinity, whereas music is is bodiless.
That's actually really interesting. And
Yeah, I really like
Baroque
that.
music is beautiful. It's almost as if like you
Yeah.
take any piece of like really beautiful music, especially Faustian music, and just run it through the Spengler bot and just come up with some like crazy interpretation of it. Baroque is even more the beautiful because it embodies or encapsulates the bodilessness of the infinite, this pursuit of the infinite by the Faustian spirit.
Mm, yeah.
What other interesting pieces?
We've talked about the height of
Destiny
Faustian
conversation.
art in bits and pieces of the Baroque
Yeah.
during this
Is there any
episode.
other parts about? Should we talk about?
We can talk about. Okay, so this was confusing. So I said earlier how Spengler uses Impressionism in a different sense to how it's conventionally used. He also does talk about Impressionism as the 19th century, largely French artistic movement, which makes things even more confusing. But he talks about Impressionism, the 19th century artistic movement, as an example of the decline of Western art and culture after the high point of the Baroque.
mm,
And he says basically oil painting exhausted its potentiality at the end of the 17th century after the great masters of oil painting died. So I think for him particularly Rembrandt is the peak of Western oil painting. And after Rembrandt, everything goes downhill. Sort of like how Michelangelo exhausted the inner possibilities of sculpture, Rembrandt did the same to oil painting. He's just cucking all oil paintings after him. Even if you pick up a brush now, Rembrandt is cuckolding you from all those centuries ago. I think Ed mentioned to me that basically every episode we mentioned cuckoldry.
some like vulgar fucking
just
jokes.
an obligatory part of the book
Like
club from hell.
Foot fetish jokes or like something, people's balls getting crushed.
I find the reasons he gives as to why Impressionism, the 19th century artistic movement, it's so fucking annoying talking about Spengler is his terminology. So his reasons as for why Impressionism represents a decline are pretty funny in that they're just pure Spengler. So he says, Impressionism rejects studio brown as a color. I quote, "This brown, the symbol of a spatial infinity, which had for Faustian mankind created a spiritual something out of a mere canvas, now came to be regarded quite suddenly as an offense to nature." He says that the artwork also lacks a religiosity and is becoming more mathematical and natural. And when I say religiosity, he means it in a very specific way. He doesn't mean that the art of Rembrandt was oriented towards the Christian God. He means, or at least I think he means religiosity in the sense of being guided by or being the vessel for superhuman forces. So, of these forces of the soul that guide individuals that are subtended by that soul. I'm pretty sure that's what he means by religiosity. But the French impressionist art is not guided by this inner religiosity. It's guided by, he says, science and capital N nature. So a focus on technique as an end in itself, of a conscious technique rather than a technique which merely exists to express a necessity. Yeah, and then the subject matter is more mundane. And I find this quote is really funny. So I quote, "Rembrandt's mighty landscapes lie essentially in the universe. Manet's near a railway station." So you're no longer contemplating infinity, you're contemplating a railway station. And actually, here's a quote. So what I was saying earlier about how there's a relationship between an individual's genius and talent and when in a soul's life cycle they are born, which will determine the type of art and the quality of the art that they produce. I've got a quote here, which is interesting. So, in Marais, lastly, There was all the mighty intention of the great Baroque style, but though Géricault and Daumier were not too belated to capture it in positive form, he, lacking the strength and that a tradition would have given him, was unable to force it into the world of painters' actuality. So there's strength that tradition or being born at the right time in a culture would give you.
Yeah.
And you can just get unlucky.
Yeah. That's really...
I've bucked the trend though, because in the winter of the Faustian soul, Jack BC published Tower, which everyone listening should go out and buy a copy of on Amazon.
Go to jackbc.me.
jackbc.me.
If you need to remember that it's Jack Big Cock Me. That's how Jack Big Cock Me.
Or Jack Book Club.
Or Jack Big... No. Don't confuse the matter. Jack Mr. Big Cock. Mr. Jack Big Cock Me. Go to that and buy his book Tower. It is somehow... I mean, like, it might be like...
It's the birth of a new soul.
Better than Spengler.
It's literally the best book ever written.
Yes, it's the birth. It signifies, like, there'll be like
the birth of a completely new world.
Oswald Spengler the Seventh will be writing decline.
This is the Australian
decline of Gondwana land.
This is the Gondwana land soul.
The Gondwanan
rising
soul
as the pseudomorphosis of the Western soul.
Yeah. And the pseudomorphosis of the Faustian soul by the Gondwanan soul in the form of Jack's Tower. Go to Amazon.com, search Tower by Jack BC.
You can get a taste of what the Gondwana soul will look like. Yeah. After that, he talks a lot about Wagner. He really likes Wagner. He says, like, okay, I quote, "The last of the Faustian arts died in Tristan. This work is the giant keystone of Western music." So he rates Wagner very high. After Wagner, basically, the Western culture dies and we enter civilization. Like, Wagner's the end. He completes it.
So just as a reminder, what does civilization mean in the Spenglerian sense? Why does this signify the end of the culture and the beginning of the civilization?
Capital C culture, capital C civilization. So capital C culture is it's the actualized form of a soul in the world. So that soul through inner necessity compels people to make art, political forms, etc. that express this soul. The soul eventually dies, like all biological things do. Once the soul has died, you still have the actualities of that soul in the world. The becoming soul no longer exists, but the being created by it still persists in the world in a physical form. Civilization is basically, it's almost the momentum created by a culture when it was alive, continuing. So this momentum continues and has some ballast in terms of the actualities produced by the culture that preceded it. However, no longer having inner necessity, it starts dissolving very quickly and spinning off into oblivion. Civilization tends to be characterized by a lack of focus on things like art and increasing focus on capital N nature, which we talked about more in previous episodes. The increasing mathematization of everything, the emphasis on being over becoming, the emphasis on very large world cities where culture is dissolved and there's a complete non-particularity of culture emphasized, an emphasis on money and commerce. And Spengler thought, when he was writing The Decline of the West, that he was very much living in a civilization, and that means that in 2023 we are only more so living in civilization. But anyway, our civilization basically started with Tristan by Wagner.
Why was it?
When Wagner dropped Tristan and ended the West.
It says, the symptom of decline in creative power is the fact that to produce something round and complete, the artist now requires to be emancipated from form and proportion. Its most obvious, though not its most significant manifestation, is the taste for the gigantic.
Yeah, I found this really interesting, how he's saying that as a soul gets very close to the end of its life, the art produced, and because the culture is still alive, you can still produce great art like Wagner did, but you have to strain. You need an individual of immense genius to be able to make something great at the end of culture, because the culture is just not lending you as much strength as it would have when it was younger and healthier. And this straining can often manifests in things being gigantic and dramatic. And so yeah, you can say a lot of things about Wagner's music. Wouldn't describe it as subtle.
No. That's for sure.
It's Wagner is like the death metal of classical music. And so I found that interesting when he says that at the end of culture, you get gigantic things. And then I guess that persists through into civilization. In civilization, things have only grown larger. We have skyscrapers and things like that.
One way to put that,
things grow larger and larger and larger with less and with no inner necessity. They're not symbolizing anything beyond size.
Yeah, so like in one way of putting that is potentially like overcompensation.
Yeah. Just giant, erect, big cock skyscrapers. Fucking the sky.
Like a tower. Towers fucking the sky.
Yeah. Exactly. One tower in particular.
Jack's tower. Jack's big fat tower fucking the sky.
Which everyone should read about, incidentally. Yeah. I find it pretty funny too, Spengler's dislike of the artistic scene around him when he was alive. He has such powerful old man yells at cloud energy.
Yeah.
So without the inner necessity of a soul guiding art starts just going off into any direction. And it doesn't represent anything. And it becomes purely subject to the vagaries of taste. I quote, "We go through all the exhibitions, the concerts, the theatres, and find only industrious cobblers and noisy fools who delight to produce something for the market, something that will catch on with a public for whom art and music and drama have long ceased to be spiritual necessities. At what a level of inward and outward dignity stand today that which is called art and those who are called artists? In the shareholders' meeting of any limited company or in the technical staff of any first-rate engineering works, there is more intelligence, taste, character, and capacity than in the whole music and painting of present-day Europe." I also find it interesting, I think we pointed this out in the first episode, how he says it's not that in civilization there is nothing worthwhile to be done. There's nothing worthwhile to be done in the artistic field, because that's something that you need a soul for. But when it comes to engineering and science, there's plenty to do in civilization and plenty of worthwhile things to do.
Building out the works.
All is not lost. If you can be a STEM lord in 2023 and things will be great. It's just don't try to be an artist.
So that brings us to the end.
That's it.
Of Music and Plastic. What a wild ride.
That's Music and Plastic. People now, what a wild ride. These two chapters are really, really fun. The thing is, I don't think, I wouldn't recommend someone just read these two chapters, because without having put in the hard work of syncing your mind to Spengler's mind, you probably won't appreciate just how wacky this is, or the wackiness of reading this stuff and it making sense.
Yeah, perhaps none of the chapters should really be read in isolation. They're not standalone.
No. And the thing is, any individual chapter, even chapter 1, won't necessarily make much sense in isolation. Part of the reason why I find it so hard to describe Spengler or to convey his ideas is that the book is written in such a way where understanding tends to assemble itself over time as you read it. There's not a declarative statement he makes that you read through and it's very clear and you think, okay, I understand this concept of Spengler's. Instead, it's the volume approach of examples. He just gives you lots and lots and lots of examples, and you eventually build up intuitions as to what is or isn't right in Spengler world, which is fine. It's just when you try to make the jump from that to explaining to people what Spengler was talking about in a podcast, that's quite a difficult jump to make.
So would we recommend anybody else go out and spend hours and hours and hours reading this and converting it into a podcast?
Well, no, because then they'd be competing with
so
us.
don't do that.
I don't want any competition. Don't do that. I would recommend The Decline of the West to the same person that I would recommend Evola to.
Names.
Names. If you get a kick out of reading
like esoteric
something that
Buddhist theology,
is esoteric but weirdly internally consistent, then I would unreservedly recommend The Decline of the West.
If you're somebody who's thinking about becoming an artist in the late Faustian civilization, then no, maybe it'd be a bit disheartening. Or maybe it would set you on the right track and stop you.
Spawn the Gondwana soul.
Spawn the Gondwana soul with Jack Bigcock.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Yeah. What else is there? I don't know. Shout out to Alex. Shout out to Barapam.
Next episode is...
Shout out to Hagersten. Shout out to Sweden.
Shout out to Sweden.
Shout out to JBO Johansson.
Shout out to everyone on the Discord.
Shout out to Nam Tam.
There's an episode coming out on... What did we just read yesterday? Oh, The Secret. That's coming out soon. Lighten things up. And also we'll be doing The Art of the Deal soon as well. So like
Fuck, that book's
splitting
boring.
up.
I'm spoiling the episode. It's just The Art of the Deal. Maybe I'm just too used to mainlining like compilations of the best bits of Trump speeches. It feels like Diet Trump. It's just, this is so much more boring than so much other Trump stuff.
And then we'll finish off volume 1 of Spengler in a couple of weeks, and move on to something else, I guess, for a bit, probably before picking up Spengler volume 2.
I've got something that I reckon we definitely need to cover. This was recommended to us by Cryo. Shout out to Cryo for this recommendation.
Cryo's had some
this
good
is a really good one.
Which one are you?
He's had some excellent recommendations.
There's one on like violent anti-colonialism written from an Indigenous perspective, which I think we should read at some point.
We should definitely
just so
do
I can
that.
Justify coming over and taking your stuff off you, Jack. Give me my land back, bitch. Like, Levi, you're not even from this part of Gondwana. Get the fuck out of here.
That would be a really good one to do. Another really good one to do. Okay, so this is one Cryo recommended. A Pickle for the Knowing Ones by Timothy Dexter.
What the fuck?
Published in 1802. Timothy Dexter, he was some guy who came into a lot of money. I think he inherited a bunch of money. And people kept trying to fuck with him and make him lose the money by suggesting to him really terrible business decisions, which he just did them. And then basically always just through intense luck, they ended up making lots of money. And so he wrote this book called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, which is unpunctuated, just has the most bizarre spelling, has just random capital letters, and is basically him talking about how good he is. And then, having published the first edition and handed it out for free to people, he published a second edition. And the change in the second edition was that people complained that there wasn't enough punctuation in the first one. So he just included a page at the end of commas and full stops and exclamation marks and things and said, here's your punctuation. You use it as you like. It's only like 30 pages. I really want to read it.
Yeah, sure, let's do that one. It sounds like a nutcase.
Such a loose unit.
It's like you've just made all your money and you just don't give a fuck. You're just like, I'll just do what I want. I don't need this book to sell.
Made a lot of money through complete luck. Complete luck by following the advice of people who are trying to make you lose money.
Yeah, sure, let's read it. It's $1 on Kindle.
So yeah, shout out to Cryo for that recommendation. That's a fantastic one.
Lord, he was a Lord Timothy Dexter. Yeah, there's been some other ones, and I think the next big book that we'll read, like hard book, will be probably the Technological Society. Hey, maybe in the new year. Yeah, and we'll have a few not so intense books for a while, and then at some point potentially we might do volume 2 of Decline of the West. Anyways, we should let the good folks get about their days. Do you have any last things to say?
We should let the good folks go and buy copies of the Tower by
jackbc.me.
Thank you for listening.